Hey guys, what's up? We have a new card and the final card to be released within the Legendary Duel Pack 2, at least to do with Weevil Underwood, the Insect Duelist. And it's a card most people will remember very clearly for its poisoning effect against Yugimoto and, of course, his Gaia the Dragon Champion.
I wouldn't be so sure about that! Look again!
What? No.
It's poison, Yugi! Poison particles from my great Moth! Each time it uses its hurricane attack, it releases tons of these tiny toxic particles!
As is depicted, obviously, in the artwork. The card is called Corrosive Scales, and it is a normal trap card. It says, 1. Activate this card by targeting one insect monster you control. Equip this card to that target. Your opponent cannot attack insect monsters other than the equipped monster you control. 2. Each time your opponent normal or special summons a monster or monsters, while this card is equipped, or activates a card or effect while this card is equipped, place one scale counter on all face-up monsters your opponent controls. If, because of a card/effect activation, place them when that activated card or effect resolves. Each monster your opponent controls loses 100 attack and defense for each scale counter on it. Now, the first effect is obvious, that it can only work with insect types, as this is what Weevil uses, and it would be too much if it could benefit more types than this. The ability to force your opponent's attacks only onto the equipped monster reminds me of insect pheromones, you know, the natural attraction insects have towards each other. This benefits your weaker insects, as they can do what they need to, whether this be set up such as through Kizatai, who lets you gain life points every turn from the monster that attacked it, equal to half their attack points, to insects that can inflict damage or set up additional supportive effects. An example is Legal and its ability to attack directly, or even as far back as Millennium Scorpion. Obviously, that has the ability to, every time it destroys a monster by battle, it gains 500 additional attack. So it starts off at 2,000. You imagine 2 or 3 attacks later, you've got a 3,000 beta monster, which cannot be attacked or dealt with other than by card effects. The second effect is, however, what we are really here for. Though every time your opponent does anything, this lets you place a scale counter on an opponent's face-up monsters, and for each one they lose 100 attack and defense. This is a very unique effect and takes a smaller increment of stat reduction than obviously the anime effect. The nearest thing I can think of that has a similar effect to this is Pum Princess, but then again that's a per turn kind of deal where it's in a sense per round between you and your opponent. Each monster is losing 200 attack and defense, and I would actually argue it's much better than this card, as though it has the risk of being destroyed by spell or trap removal, it is not as specific as this card is. It's more generic and would work in most given situations. However, if your opponent is making a number of moves within a turn, you could see potentially with this card 3 or 4 counters added to monsters in a turn. A final benefit is that it places counters on all monsters your opponent has when they do anything, not just on one card. This can at best be dealing with 5 counters, provided your opponent has a full field of monsters, assuming they're obviously just going in for the one summon that turn or the one card effect. The downsides of this card, and believe me when I say there are a lot of them, this only works on your opponent activating and doing lots of combos with their cards. Your opponent may see this card coming and think to only use 1 or 2 cards in order to properly deal with this card, and to obviously minimize the stat reduction effect they will incur. Another problem is that all your opponent's monsters have to be face up to have this effect apply to them. When facing defensive decks, or those that can work between offense and defense quickly, your opponent can alter their strategy to prevent this from doing much. A final problem is that this is a trap card, making it much slower to work. This can respond to your opponent doing something, but can easily be negated, and the work can be removed very quickly, especially with the vast number of extra deck monsters around enables them to use any heavily countered cards into probably the 2 easiest to access out of the extra deck monsters, which are obviously the link monsters, as you can have some quite generic link monsters, such as, you know, the link version of Gaia the Fierce Knight, that requires 3 monsters as standard. It doesn't require specific restrictions on them. Or obviously you have exceeds monsters if you have multiple of the same leveled monster. Overall, I understand what Konami was trying to do with this card. They wanted to force your opponent to only be focused on the equipped monster, and to enable the basic stat reduction effect, in the same way as like a poison effect. I have just thought of another example that this reminds me of, somewhat to a lesser extent than Pun Princess, and that is of course the field spell Venom Swamp, that reduces attack stat of non-venom monsters by 500 per turn during the end phase. This was used during Yu-Gi-Oh! GX during the 3rd season between Jaden and Professor Viper. There is one card that would work alongside this to force your opponent to have monsters face up, and this is again a very old card. It's called Light of Intervention. It forces monsters to be summoned in face-up defense position. The problem with that is it requires all monsters to be in face-up defense position, so that includes yours. If you have a very specific strategy you're going for, whether that be through flip effects or you just want to have a high defensive monster, your opponents are going to be able to read your stat line and then decide how and when they're going to proceed to destroy that particular monster. Anyway, this card was released in Dark Beginning 1 on the 12th of October 2004. It's a very old card, and honestly it's so outdated. You could probably find better versions somewhere along the lines. I can see this card having moderate play, if only for the anime recreation duels for newer and younger players, or as a means of protecting your other insect types. But I'm sorry to say this, but Corrosive Scales will not see play as a staple. There are much better cards to run within the deck, and out of its 4 support cards, this is probably the least impressive. It does, however, benefit less specifically within the insects, as if it had said something like it must be equipped to a monster summoned through a petite moth or something along those lines, then that would be too specific. However, as it's generally run within any insect type deck, I can see one card being played potentially of this. It does next to nothing, unfortunately, to fix the problems with the insect types. I feel this would have been a much better card if Konami had made it an equipment spell card that maintained most of its effects. Obviously, if it had the ability to protect itself as well, that would be great. However, I see, rather than it gathering counters on your opponent's monsters, It would have been better if there had been an onus on your monster being equipped by that. That way you could guarantee your monster is face up and gaining the scale counters in order to reduce everyone else's attack points. It forces your opponent to lose the attack, to make the insect seem like it is impervious to poison. It would be that kind of idea that, say for example, I know this is quite a strange example, you've got the poisoned dart frogs of the Amazon rainforest. They're poisonous, but they don't become sick from their own poison. That's the whole idea of if they were to have improved this card in my mind. I don't mind so much that the stat loss is minimal, but by relying on your opponent getting these counters, you have no other means of generating these counters, making it an incredibly slow card by focusing on one monster and applying the reduction effect. It would have obviously made this card a lot more consistent. So what do you guys think of this card? Am I being too harsh to judge it like this? Is there a means of making it so that your opponent cannot avoid building up these counters, or is it as dead as I believe it to be? Obviously, I would consider as well, you could run other stat reduction cards alongside this. For some reason, insects and plants do have small variations of synergy. An off-the-cuff example of this would be something like Prickle Fairy, which is a plant that forces, whilst it's on your side of the field face up, your opponent not to be able to attack insect monsters. And I'm sure there are other plant-based support that works alongside this. It makes sense, really, considering, insects depend on plants to survive. Leave your comments down below, like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe, click the bell for notifications, and as always, thank you for taking the time to watch this video.